And if you're a psychiatrist and you're an MD, it's the standard of care increasingly for almost everybody who's having some difficulty in life is to medicate them, to drug them with psychotropic drugs. Whereas if you're a PhD psychologist, you can't prescribe, except in a few states. Some psychologists have fought for prescription rights, but ordinarily there isn't that kind of a legal peer professional pressure if you're a PhD psychologist to medicate everyone, whereas if you are an MD psychiatrist, there is that pressure that you're actually doing something wrong because you're not putting some kid on speed, Ritalin, amphetamines, because the kid's not paying attention to school and he's paying attention to only things he's interested in. Nowadays, the most common so-called mental illness, mental disorder is depression. Depression, 25, 30 years ago, it was very, very rare. Antidepressants, the most famous being Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, these are handed out by not just psychiatrists, but by general practitioners, like aspirin almost. We have increasingly in our society childhood, so-called childhood disorders, which you never would have saw. It would be very, very rare, almost, you'd almost never see 25, 30 years ago any kind of kid, any child taking any kind of psychiatric medication. Now this is common, right? I mean, I talk to kids all the time, and they tell me the statistics that they hear 10% or so of them are on psychiatric medications, totally wrong. They laugh. And most of the kids that I talk to, they tell me 25 to 30% of the kids in their schools are taking some kind of a ADD medication, Ritalin or Adderall or Addies as they call them, or they're taking some kind of a antidepressant, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft medication, or increasingly, more of them are taking antipsychotic chasers, with these drugs. They're taking these drugs called Risperdal and Zyprexa, which were really the replacements for these heavyweight tranquilizer drugs, Haldol and Thorazine, that went off patent, and the pharmaceutical companies created these so-called atypical antipsychotics, which are really not that much different than the old-fashioned ones, and they are creating enormous amounts of side effects. Many reasons why you have obese kids out there. More and more of American children are obese. Lots of reasons for that. But one of the least talked about ones is that so many of them are on these antidepressants, on these antipsychotics, which make it more likely that they're going to be obese. So all of these kids are being diagnosed with depression, with bipolar. The idea of any kind of kid being diagnosed with bipolar 25, 30 years ago was absurd. Kids were moody, right? Kids went up and down. Kids, would talk about feeling like suicidal one day and talking about like they're going to be, the president of the United States the next day. This was a kid kind of thing. But somewhere along the way, the psychiatry, pharmaceutical, industrial establishment, and make no mistake, they're proud partners. They don't hide this. There's a proud partnership between pharmaceutical companies and the American Psychiatric Association and the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill. They're proud partners with one another, that financially. And that between them, they decided that all kinds of kids were disorder, attention deficit disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and a whole bunch of other kids were mentally ill, seriously mentally ill. And so now you have literally 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and given major heavyweight drugs, antipsychotic drugs. It's problematic enough that all these kids who weren't paying attention to boring schools were given speed, amphetamines, which is what Adderall is. Now they're given these heavy, sedating, zombifying antipsychotic drugs like Risperdal, like Zyprexa, like Seroquel. So in fact, you've got antidepressants, and this is not Bruce Levine saying this. This is finally now the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, black box warnings saying that these antidepressants, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, make it more likely that a young person, a kid, a teenager, young adult, will have suicidal thoughts than if they're not taking them. Okay, twice as likely, actually, if you take a look at the statistics. And so you have to ask, what kind of population buys into the fact that something is an antidepressant drug that actually makes it more likely you have suicidal thoughts and feelings? That seems to me more like a pro-depressant drug. But it doesn't seem that way, I guess, to a lot of doctors out there who are being told that just because, the FDA approves something for something, you can use it. The whole idea of what off-label prescribing means is that there are many, many drugs out there that the FDA has not approved for a particular use. But, and this frightens a lot of people when they discover this, is once a drug is an approved drug, a doctor can choose to prescribe it for anything. They can use an antidepressant, for somebody. They can decide somebody's like, well, they're laughing too much out there in life, or they're having too good a time, or they're, or whatever, that they decided that somebody's in a grief state. Their father died a month ago and they should have gotten over it. And so we can prescribe anything that's approved. And so the interesting thing that drug companies have gotten in trouble for lately, major fines, Eli Lilly, a lot of the other major drug companies, Eli Lilly makes Zyprexa, makes Prozac, a lot of the other drug companies, what they have gotten in trouble for, in some cases multi-million-dollar, some cases even billion-dollar fines, is for marketing off-labeling drugs. And what that means is that while doctors, any doctor, any physician's allowed to prescribe any drug for anything, drug company sales representatives, okay, they're not allowed to pitch drugs for off-market use, and they've done a lot of that kind of stuff. So, for example, Zyprexa being one of Eli Lilly's drugs, they've had off-label marketing for that to sedate old people who weren't psychotic, okay, or sedate young people who weren't labeled with psychoses, and their salespeople were caught doing this kind of stuff. And so that's one thing that they are really not allowed to do. Drug companies often, when they start messing around with a drug, it's routine. A lot of these psychiatric drugs that become famous psychiatric drugs, originally they weren't being planned for the use that they were given, that they ultimately had. One of the things that people, when you're talking about drug development, is that a lot of people don't know that the Food and Drug Administration does not do any independent tests on these drugs. That these drugs, every drug that's approved, the drug company, they themselves does the testing on these drugs. So some people immediately, they get shocked and they said, that sounds like, the fox guarding the house. You mean we're using all drugs off of the data that was furnished, that was drug company data? I said, yeah. I mean, what happens is drug companies do tests on these drugs, and then they are registered, these tests are registered with the FDA, and they furnish this data to the FDA, all right? And so we're basing potentially multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drugs that the drug companies have already sunk millions of dollars in. We're now trusting that these drug companies are being completely upfront about everything that they're doing. Well, we know from experience that that's been a bad idea. Okay, so these drugs get submitted to the FDA. And then evaluators from the FDA, the drug tests, supposedly for a drug to win approval, the drug company can have done 10, 20 different tests, and the drug has been found to be ineffective, no better than a placebo. But all they need to do is find a couple of these studies that the drug does a little bit better than a placebo, all right? And so the drug companies, what they want to do all the time is there's two ways to make a drug do better than a placebo. One is to have a really great drug, but that's hard. It's much easier to have a really crappy placebo. That's easy. And so what they do for the case of antidepressants, when you do real science, you find that there's almost no difference between the antidepressants, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, and placebo drugs. Okay? The way that you kind of somehow try to create a slight difference, and you have to understand that even with all this drug company dice loading of the experimental design, in the majority of drug trials, the placebo still does better or as well as the drug. But they do lots of dice loading. One is what I mentioned before, the actual research instrument that they use to assess whether a drug is effective, something like the Hamilton Rating Scale for depression, which is heavily loaded in items influenced by the drug and don't talk about whether people are feeling more meaningful and more satisfying in their lives and that kind of thing. So you load it that way. Another interesting way that the drug testing is loaded is that in real science, the whole idea of giving a placebo is to have something what we call a double-blind control, which means that neither the researcher nor the subject knows, who's getting the drug and who's getting the sugar pill placebo. You do that because we know from science, especially when you're talking about things like depression, people's expectations are hugely important in determining whether they're going to get better or not. So you try to tease out whether somebody's getting better just because of their expectations or they're getting better because this drug actually has something therapeutic about it. And that's why you do these kinds of things. So in real science, what you would do is have what we call an active placebo versus a sugar pill. Why do we do that? Because we know when people take sugar pills, they can penetrate the double blind. They can guess that they're taking a sugar pill, and they know that they're not taking the drug. So that to do real science, the whole point of real science, having a double blind control, is so that the subject nor the researcher can identify who's really taking the placebo and who's taking the drug. And so what you do in real science is give somebody what we call an active placebo. So something that's not a therapeutic agent, but something that creates some physiological effects, unlike a sugar pill. So it would be much more difficult to penetrate the double blind. Well, of course, drug companies are never going to do that. No drug company study ever uses an active placebo because it's making it more likely that the placebo will do as well as the drug. There's a lot of other techniques that drug companies do in their research design to make it more likely their drug will look better than placebo. But with all of their dice loading, it hasn't worked out that well. And so we've got a lot of, been in the mainstream press over the last few years, that there's a lot of stuff out there showing that that these research, when you look at it in aggregate, the placebos studies, the placebos do as well or better than the drugs. Why don't doctors know that? Well, one of the reasons why doctors don't know that is drug companies have control over what gets published in journal articles or not. They make sure that the things that get published in journal articles are the studies that showing these drugs are effective. Over 90% of the studies that showed these drugs to be effective, these antidepressants to be effective, were published to be in journal articles. But if you took a look at all the studies registered with the FDA, none of the ones that that were showing them to be ineffective were getting published. So there was really only about half of the studies registered with the FDA showed these drugs to be effective, but 90% of them were getting published. The drug companies are paying the folks who are doing the research. That's how you make big money if you're a psychiatrist, you're a consultant, you're a researcher, or any doctor, not just psychiatrists, physicians in general, that you're getting paid by drug companies to do the research. I mean, what's the likelihood of a drug company paying a researcher a second time after that researcher has done a study that showed the drug not to be effective and they published it in a prestigious journal? You think that researcher is going to get paid again by that drug company to do another study? Why should they? It wouldn't be in their best corporate interests. I mean, they're spending money to make money. And when they do a study, and when they're paying a researcher, they're hoping that the thing has some credibility with the FDA and the general public, but it's good for them financially. You could make these drug companies, the major pharmaceutical companies, who make enormous amounts of profits, higher on average than any other industry out there, contribute to a pool for the Food and Drug Administration. Or you wouldn't even do that. Even a better way to do it, if we're going to have things that are any kind of a Food and Drug Administration, that it would be financed by the public. Because the way it's set up now, the way the Food and Drug Administration is set up now, is it really is almost like winning the Oscars or winning the Grammys. It's a revolving door industry. The Food and Drug Administration, the people who are favorable to pharmaceutical companies, they leave out and they get good jobs with the pharmaceutical companies. No different than the military-industrial complex or the energy-industrial complex. All these industrial complexes are boringly the same. And so there's all kinds of incentives when you are in the Food and Drug Administration, unless you're those rare people, and they're all whistleblowers with people with great integrity, but for the most part, the financial incentives are to do things to curry favor with drug companies so that when you get out, you get a great job with a drug company, which happens all the time. If you were a CEO or you're an executive in a pharmaceutical company, your loyalty is not to the patients, customers out there. Your loyalty is to your shareholders. That's who that's who your official loyalty is. You're going to do everything you can to make sure that if you put a certain amount of money down on a product, that it's going to become one of these blockbuster drugs. So there's every disincentive in the world once you've done some 50 million, 100 million in research development, and you get to the stages where you're actually testing these drugs on people, that there's all kinds of jobs that'll be lost and all kinds of money to be lost when it's found out that this drug is dangerous or it's not as effective as a placebo. So it does happen. There are people in all these places, even in drug companies and in the FDA, who have integrity, but the whole system is set up to disincentivize that and to incentivize people doing things that are going to create unsafe and ineffective drugs. Once these drugs become approved then there's every incentive for these pharmaceutical companies to want to use these drugs for as many things as possible. So, for example, way back, the whole antipsychotic industry, 25 years ago, drugs like Haldol or Thorazine or Trilofan, it was only a $200 million a year industry. It was very rare that people would be labeled as crazy enough or wild enough or psychotic enough to be medicated with these major tranquilizing drugs. But the drug industry discovered that we could use a lot of these newer drugs that don't have these drugs called Zyprexa and Risperdal and Seroquel, that we don't have to just use them for people who've been labeled psychotically agitated. We can use them for all kinds of people who we'd like to control a lot more. So some kid in a classroom. And so all of a sudden you went from an industry, a total industry of antipsychotic drugs being a $250 million industry, to Zyprexa a couple of years back, one antipsychotic drug alone topping $3 billion a year, okay, by being used for all kinds of ways, including, chilling out people, old folks in nursing homes who, were understaffed, chilling out kids in classrooms here who were driving their teachers maybe a little bit crazy. So you can just expand the usage of these things. How does that zombify and pacify a population? Well, it's quite obvious. I mean, it's literally write pages out of Brave New World, Huxley's Brave New World. You've got a population where you've got giant pharmaceutical companies who are incentivized to create drugs that are used for more and more populations that are creating some degree of havoc. There's no institutions that are stopping that. The American Psychiatric Association, they work in financial partnership with pharmaceutical companies. National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, so-called a family group, they take millions of dollars from drug companies in grants. National Institute of Mental Health, which is the government agency. There's a revolving door of employment between the NIMH and the drug companies, same with the Food and Drug Administration. So there's no major institutions blocking this huge growth of drugs for people out there, which more it's become sort of almost mainstream to sort of see the similarities between Soma, the drug used in Brave New World, and the all the psychiatric drugs that are being used now. It's a drug to kind of drugs to kind of get people to chill out. I ask kids all the time, what's the actual effect on you of that ADHD drug, that Ritalin, that Adderall? All these other drugs, Dexedrine that they've used, what's the actual effect? Well, for many of them, and their parents and their teachers, agree it doesn't have any kind of effect in making them pay more attention. But for some of them, it does. Some of them, superficially, they look like they are paying attention. They're certainly more manageable and more compliant in a classroom. That does, in fact, happen. And those are the kids I'm really interested in. I say, well, what's happening? What's happening to you? And they're saying, well, what happens to me, Bruce, is like, well, I know at some level I'm just as bored as ever, but I don't care as much. And I'm just not as antsy or as agitated about being bored. Sort of in similar ways to people who use nicotine and smoke cigarettes on crappy jobs that they're in. They know they're just as bored as ever, but if they could get their nicotine hit, it takes the edge away from that. And so that's in lots of ways what psychotropic drugs do. Psychotropic drug are illegal drugs or psychotropic drugs like marijuana and heroin, and psychiatric drugs are all psychotropic drugs. And what that means is that they're drugs that affect your neurotransmitters. Some of the famous neurotransmitters nowadays are serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, which, by the way, are the neurotransmitters that cocaine affects. And the same neurotransmitters that amphetamines affect, which are kind of synthetic cocaine. And that's what you give to kids with ADHD, these synthetic cocaine amphetamines. That's what they're being given. It doesn't have the same effect when you're taking something in pill form as it is when you're snorting it or when you're IVing something. But these drugs are very, very, very much similar. And almost all of these drugs that are psychotropic drugs, some of them are more likely to be uppers, right? The amphetamines, some of them are more likely to be downers. But what they all have in common is they disconnect you from what you're really feeling. And so you ask people all the time who are on these stuff, or you ask kids, it's like, they'll say stuff like, well, I think I used to care about that, and I kind I think I still care about it, but I don't feel as much caring. You know, I think I hate that person. You know, I think I hate that guy who's mean to me, but I don't feel that hate as much. It takes the edge off of negative emotions. It takes the edge off of positive emotions here. And, you know, for some people, they call that successful treatment. You know, for guys like me, this is like Brave New World.
Visit Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. When you're on the sites, you can also tune in 24 hours a day to my daily radio broadcast. There's also a free iPhone app to listen to the syndicated radio show when and where you want.